How long are we going to have to wait to get a new Sly Cooper game? What's taking Sony so long in terms of remastering the Infamous games? And will we ever see another Ape Escape game? These and so many other questions are often directed at Sony in regards to their older franchise and classic game series. But it seems like every time the audience gets passionate about the idea of rebooting something like Parappa the Rapper, those cries often fall on deaf ears. Because it seems like at the end of the day, the history that made PlayStation the tour de force it is in console gaming now is not a history that they care about at all. Now, you might disagree considering the popularity and passion that Sony seems to have for the Astrobot franchise, but I would argue that the Astrobot franchise can also be used as a really good dumping ground for the history of PlayStation's franchises in gaming leading up until this point in time. Meaning that for every person asking, where's the next Jak and Daxter game, they can point to something like Astrobot and be like, see, we already made a nostalgic reference some time ago on a game that isn't actually the game that you want, but might still be a game that you enjoy. And this has been happening for a while, especially under leadership of former PlayStation executive Jim Ryan, who was notorious for not caring about old games, especially games in Sony's back catalog. Okay, so if Sony doesn't care about their history, maybe they can find ways to incorporate old games into their future. The thing is that a lot of old PlayStation IP does not fit the future of Sony. Because if Sony did decide to eventually reboot a classic franchise, they would probably end up doing it in the form of a live service game, something that everyone would hate and would either get canceled before it ever made it out the door or die 6 months after launch. And then Sony can turn to its leadership team and say, see, we told everyone that they didn't actually want a new Infamous game, and then we made one with daily login bonuses and blind boxes, and look what happened. I'm not saying that this would happen with every single Sony franchise that they decided to reboot, but I think taking a Spider-Man 2 budget and applying it to a new Infamous game simply would not fly with Sony's bean counters. Now you might be thinking, well, what if they had a more modestly budgeted game that felt like a love letter to classic PlayStation games? Sure, some games come out and actually do have a modest budget and scope, but that happens far less often than we would actually like. And that's because PlayStation isn't in the business of making a cool $1 million here and there. They're looking to make $1 billion every time they put out a game, if not more. And unfortunately, that isn't likely to happen by rebooting the SOCOM series or bringing back MAG, or remastering Lair, or even trying to reboot some of its classic sports franchises. But in a world where the game industry is making cuts all across the board, I just can't imagine anyone at Sony really going to bat for bringing back a lot of its classic franchises. And as a final example, while I may be interested in something like a new Resistance game, I think it's painfully obvious that a studio like Insomniac is probably going to be making Marvel games until the end of time at this point, because that is where the money is, not in honoring PlayStation's legacy and anything that isn't the Astrobot games.